think this is going to be really fun to have a conversation that I hope you will find interesting and that will result in your buying the book. So for those who don't know much about Steve, I'm going to try to elicit some information that can help put in context why this book was written and why write it now. And so I want to start first with the question of why the interest in politics? What was it, in fact, April 4th, Martin Luther King's assassination? What drew you to look at politics, be involved in politics, even run for office?
That's a good question. First of all, thank all of you for being here, and thank Harley for the introduction. And then I was saying, as Harley was doing the introduction, I was like, Harley's really read the book. And then I was like, well, maybe he just read the first sentence and the last sentence. I'm really glad. I've been doing a lot of events since the book came out, and I didn't actually know until a week or two ago it was going to be a conversation with Maria. And I was like, oh, I have to talk to Maria. So we have these conversations a lot, and so it's actually good to. I don't think I've ever been asked that question. I do think that for me, in terms of why politics, I think there's probably two parts to it. One is I've always been intrinsically interested in it. I mean, I've said that like some people like gardening, I like politics. Right? And so I've very much been drawn to it. But also, I am quite literally a child of the civil rights movement. Right? So we desegregated our neighborhood in Cleveland Heights, Ohio in 1964 when we moved there. I talk in the book about how they wouldn't sell the house to my parents. They were African American. I had to get a white civil rights lawyer to buy it and deed it over to them, and also then use that as an example of the racial wealth gap in the country. So I always had a very strong interest in civil rights. Read all of the biographies of Martin Luther King in my elementary school library. So I always had one of my earliest memories was when I was 3 or 4 years old going to see Dr. King. My father took me when he came to Cleveland, and so that was always with me very deeply. And my grandfather was a minister in Black Church in Cleveland, Glenville Church of God. So I had those like civil rights and really the social justice religious tradition. And this interest in politics. And that for me, that all came together very powerfully when I was 20 years old. Jesse Jackson ran for president. And so you had someone with a lot of religious metaphor running an electoral campaign that was tangibly connected to the civil rights movement. And so and that's how I actually open up the book, is about Reverend Jackson and Andy Young waiting for Martin Luther King on April 4th, 1968. He comes out, they see him murdered, and then 40 years later, Reverend Jackson, with tears coming down his face, is watching the first black president walk out in Grant Park in Chicago, showing both how much the country has changed in that time period, demographically, that we could elect a black president, and also in terms of how Obama's election is an outgrowth of the civil rights movement and the work that actually came through that. So for me, and I talk about the bridge that the Rainbow Coalition Justice Action provided between the civil rights movement and Obama's election. In his 88 convention speech, he says, all of you think you are seated, but you're really standing on somebody's shoulders. Ladies and gentlemen, Rosa Parks, the mother of the civil rights movement, brings her on stage during his convention speech in the national television audience. So that tangible connection to the civil rights movement was very inspiring to me. And I guess that's the last interest of how I got to the book piece, was that it seemed clear to me that Obama's election was an extension and an outgrowth of the civil rights movement. A new era had come about demographically and politically, but I felt that too few people who run and fund campaigns in the Democratic Party and progressive movement understood that, and so really need to try to make the case that this was in fact a new period that we're in now.
So you talk about the Rainbow Coalition, and we share the fact that we went to Stanford as undergrads in different time periods, right? He's younger than I am. And so I'm familiar with certainly a lot of the cross-collaboration among groups at Stanford, but I certainly over the years was surprised how more difficult it was to do in real life, especially when it came to politics. So I want to ask, what experiences have led you to think that in fact there could be a new American majority? Because you basically argue in the book, among one of the things, is that they're between women, progressive whites, African American, Latinos, Asian people of color, that in fact, pooling our resources and our votes together, we could really change the direction of this country. But, so tell me, why are you so optimistic?
Yeah, it's funny, because I get that kind of a question, particularly like in the Bay Area. And so I think there is a spectrum of where communities people are at in terms of grappling with these issues. And places like the Bay Area are further along, and so it brings up a different, additional set of challenges. But I'm optimistic because the first time in the history of this country, the people of the United States elected an African American president, and even more importantly, re-elected an African American president, where 5 million fewer whites voted for him, but there was still the numbers to be able to actually elect him. And so that to me is the evidence around that this majority actually exists in terms of being able to win elections. And I do say in the book that this is not I'm not making a prescription for solving every ism and being able, we can all work together and everything's going to be perfect, but that we can win elections and gain power and make changes while we're working on the other isms and all the other issues that are more complicated in terms of getting us along together. So, and I frankly don't want to have to put it sequentially. If we can get healthcare for 18 million people who didn't have it before, while we're still grappling with the tensions, I think, within and between the different groups, we should do that. And I do feel that the fundamental, what's fascinating about this election now, what's most fascinating to me is all of the conservatives saying they don't understand Trump and how Trump is not conservative. And I'm like, well, what could be more conservative wanting to round up 12 million Mexicans and ship them out of the country, right? Isn't that like a foundational, and I do think it's a foundational principle. That's why, at one of the chapters of the book I call it Blinded by the White, is that the history of this country and this battle from the time of the very first Immigration Act of 1790, which said to be a citizen you had to be a free white person, which was good law explicitly until 1952, is the battle is, are we primarily white male country, or are we a multiracial country? And that, I would submit, is the battle going on right now in this election. And they keep saying, Trump saying, make America great again. Well, when exactly does he point to when it was great? And what was going on at that point in time with people of color and women, et cetera? And so that, I feel, is the struggle we're in, is are we gonna go back to a period when this was primarily and proudly a white country? Or are we going to move forward more aggressively and unapologetically to a multiracial country? And that's, I think, what hangs in the balance in this election.
So one of the things about President Obama's election, as you refer, is the coalition that put him there. Now, one of the questions may be, is the coalition really there? Is that majority really there? Or was it attractiveness of that particular candidate? And let me put it in this context. Having served in the Clinton administration, I'm sure there are folks around here who did not like the centrist part, the triangulation that Clinton did. But the folks the DLC Democrat, who put together that, shall we say, message and advertising and outreach, in retrospect, once Clinton left office, they weren't able to keep that centrist Democratic power going, and failed to realize that actually it was both the context and the triangulation, but also the singular abilities of that presidential candidate. Could we have the same problem with the fact that President Obama may be the only person who could kind of pull everything together?
I do think that is the central debate in Democratic politics right now. And I think there are a lot of people who argue that it was a singular, unreplicable figure, and that we'll never have this again because it was so unique. But I don't believe that. I believe that Obama was the cresting of a demographic movement, where that the people of color were 12% of the country's population in the 1960s, they're 38% now. That the electorate was 28% people of color in 2012, will likely be 29, if not 30% this election. So my core argument in the book is that there is a demographic majority. If you look at the metrics from the 2012 election, which I use because I think that was the clearer signal around what he stood for. Universal health care, he'd done the Dreamers piece beforehand, marriage equality, Lilly Ledbetter Act. He had staked out positions, and then people voted for that. And 80% of people of color voted for that, and 39% of whites voted for that. And those percentages against the entire eligible voter population is 51% of the population. So my analogy is that Obama's fundamentally from Hawaii. He's a surfer, right? And so he caught a wave and has surfed that wave very well, but the waves are going to keep coming. And the waves are demographic waves, and so I think that it's not just dependent upon him. And a failure to appreciate that it's not just him is going to be to our detriment politically.
So let me be a little sort of devil's advocate here. One of the other things that you were very involved in was the divestment movement, South Africa, which was, I think, a very clear example that numbers alone do not ensure political power. And if you look at yes, the demographic change, but standing alone, what has to happen in order for those numbers to actually translate into political power?
People were saying, do you want to give a talk or do you just want to have a conversation with Maria? I was like, oh, let's just have a conversation. I forgot that her questions are very probing and piercing.
You
Well, again, I think that it's not accidental and it's not irrelevant that we've had the Obama election. Because you could make these arguments mathematically, but they have played themselves out in reality. And they played themselves out twice to great consequence in terms of what this president has been able to do. I mean, obviously he hasn't to do everything, but the country is very different than it would have been had he not been the president. And I think you also see it playing itself out in other elections as well. I think one of the things that's least appreciated around the most recent elections, it was 3 weeks ago, was what happened in Chicago and it happened in Cleveland with the district attorney races, right? So the Black Lives Matter movement went heavily after the district attorney in Chicago who did not bring charges against the officer who shot Laquan McDonald 18 times and tried to cover that up. And so they have this whole, hashtag Buy Anita campaign, BYE Anita, and they got her out. And then similarly, which was less on the radar, in Cleveland. So Tim McGinty, who did not bring charges against the cops who killed Tamir Rice, they voted him out. And there's a whole map. I mean, I'm from Cleveland originally. There's a map showing that it was the black part of Cleveland who voted McGinty out. So that to me shows that there's something happening in the population. So that's where I come back to an issue around are we multiracial or are we whites only the way that we used to be? And the multiracial part is now numerically significant enough to win elections nationally, to win elections in 34 states across the country, to have a majority of certainly of the Senate, and ultimately the Congress, and it's very gerrymandered right now. So I think that it was they kept power in South Africa through sheer force and through violent force. And they had to fight back through violent force. And so that's what enabled them to preserve that for so long in that situation. But we have had revolutionary changes in terms of the composition of our electorate without having that level of violence. And so the question now is, are we going to preserve that, double down on that direction, invest massive amounts of money in those communities, in those organizations, in those leaders, or are we going to chase the shrinking sector, which is the conservative white swing voter? That to me is the directional challenge that we're facing right now in the 2016 election.
So in this election cycle, much has been written about who Cruz and Trump are attracting, right? The sort of disengaged, the white working class that is feeling a sense of hopelessness, lack of opportunity. I sometimes not joke, but say, well, welcome to the world of African Americans and Latinos who live without hope in future, right? But somehow, now that it's happening to a broader swath of people, that anger, in some quarters, seems to be focused on precisely the group of people you think will lead us to a more progressive world. So why write this book? Or weren't you nervous that all it really does is confirm the fears of those who are so anxious and nervous about the changing demographic?
You've been talking to my wife. You're just poking them with that title, right? I think it's the seminal challenge of this moment, and I think that so much is at stake. And that in terms of now the Supreme Court hanging in the balance, what direction is it going to go in? All of the progress that we've made. I just have so many different issues in terms of obviously we've never had healthcare before. Even look at like marriage equality. I still remember the first Roseanne episode in the early 90s where she had a lesbian kiss and that all the advertisers would not be part of it. So there's been so much change, which is part of what I think makes people so anxious and upset and uncomfortable. But then I do feel like that is at risk still. I mean, it's not secured. So I just think it's not a academic exercise to try to lay out, here's some numbers and here's where I think things are going. I genuinely believe that the things that people like Martin Luther King fought and died for are at stake and at risk. And I am alarmed that too few people within the progressive movement really understand what our actual power and potential is. And they're going to pursue a path that is going to lead towards us squandering these opportunities and losing what we actually have. And that's one of the things I think which is so central, is that this effort to not embrace and not invest and not increase the turnout of voters of color, people of color, leads us to lose. And that's how we lost in 2010, that's how we lost in 2014, losing the House and the Senate. But people don't even appreciate that. It's this total downward spiral. So we run away from what we believe in, try to pursue more conservative policies, in the process alienate people we need to support us, and are not effective at getting the conservative swing voters. They'll just go with the real conservatives.
So let me push a little, because I think that for some of our members of the audience, I mean, we live steeped in this world of where money gets spent and how it gets spent and when it gets spent and by whom and targeted to whom. So why don't you take a minute or two and share with the audience sort of why you just said a lot of these operatives keep chasing the white swing voters, because I'm not sure everyone understands.
So to win an election, right, you need 50% plus one of the voters. And so you either need to turn out people who support you, and this is a mobilization effort, or you need to persuade those who are likely to vote, the higher propensity voters. And so that population tends to be older and whiter and wealthier, whereas the voters of color tend to have less income, less resources, and have not voted at a consistently higher rate historically. So then you can spend your money one of those two ways. You can run television ads trying to persuade those who are certain to vote but are less with you, or you can spend your money trying to mobilize people who are with you. And so one of the clearest examples, and as I was writing the book, I was like, I would go back and forth between these different meetings with different people in politics, and then doing the research. First I was like, I think we're wasting millions of dollars. Then I would go to meetings, do more research. I was like, I think we're wasting tens of millions of dollars. Now that I'm done with it, I genuinely believe we're wasting hundreds of millions of dollars. That the Democrats in 2012 spent $3 billion. Obama's campaign alone spent $1 billion. So just one illustrative example of that is in North Carolina, which was a top Senate race in 2014. the top priority for the Democrats to hold Kay Hagan's Senate seat. The outside groups alone spent $19 million in negative television ads, trying to define that, for that likely, trying to persuade that likely voter pool that the Republican was a bad guy. So no one ever argued that negative television ads are designed to increase voter turnout. So if they had taken that same $19 million, they could have hired 400 full-time staff people to go door to door, make phone calls, identify people, turn out people to vote. And if each of those people had just gotten 3 additional voters per week, with 2 weeks off for vacation, Kay Hagan would have won that race. And so that's what I mean, there's so much money is spent on these 30-second television ads as the default. And I think it's even fascinatingly seen in the Republican race, that Bush spent $130, $150 million mainly on television ads and got, what, 3 delegates? Whereas Trump is just tweeting, right? And so he's like tweeting and holding these press conferences and destroying these people one after the other without doing it with the 30-second television ad. So that's kind of what I'm saying in terms of but the consultants I feel are both addicted to it, and there's very little transparency and very little accountability around how they actually spend the money and whether or not, and which groupings of people that they're spending it. So that's one of the main reasons I wrote the book, one of the main missions that I'm on, is to try to both help and harass the Democrats to be able to spend their money more effectively and more in ways that have been proven in terms of actually winning in the context of a changing, evolving electorate.
So most of the political operatives I know who campaign junkies, I mean, they want to win elections, right? So given that, and given what is a pretty persuasive case that investment in one area could in fact result, as Obama showed in 2008, an expanded electorate, why is it so hard to persuade shall we say, the status quo political operatives, the people running campaigns at the federal level or even at the state level, to make these investments?
Yeah, I get that question every event I do. I need a clearer, simpler answer to it. I mean, that is the question, is that how do they add, I mean, at some level there's an inherent conflict of interest. And so the 30-second television ads, the consultants frequently have as an arrangement, they take 15% of the ads. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't, if you run $1,000 of ads or $1 million of ads, it doesn't take you any more time once you've made the ad. But the more you run it and the more it gets paid, the more money you actually get. And Ken Vogel, who writes for Politico, he's the money and politics person. He wrote a book called Big Money. When in the last chapter of his book, he talked about how he drove out to the homes of the political consultants to look at the size of the houses and the cars that were in the driveway. And they were all doing very, very well. So there's a whole element there. And there's a lack of transparency and accountability. And so nobody ever asks these people, why are you doing? Where's the evidence? But it's just a default. We're going to keep running these television ads. And so that's where I really try to lay out in my chapter 6, Invest Wisely, a set of questions that people can and should, any stakeholder should ask. I mean, you give $5 if you're a volunteer, you should be asking these questions. They never get asked them. What's your plan to get 50% plus one of the voters? How many voters of color do you need to get there? Does your budget match that plan? And are you gonna provide updates around how we're actually doing? So that none of those questions actually get asked, which is also probably I'm trying to catalyze more of a movement to hold them accountable around their spending. Because for a long time I was just mad about it, but now I genuinely feel that we are going to lose. And I think that's what happened in 2014. The mindset was not how do we increase turnout. It's how do we run away from the black president, how do we run away from immigration reform, how do we run away from health care so we don't alienate those voters. And that didn't work. And so there's not any evidentiary basis that works. So I genuinely fear that we're at a minimum will fail to take back the Senate, which we can do. There are 6 seats, I believe, that are Republicans hold in states that Obama won. But you got to have Obama-level turnout to be able to win those back. And I also feel, we'll see what happens in the kind of crazy Republican race, but none of this is to be discounted, because we actually could lose the White House as well. The people don't appreciate that turnout is a critical piece, and that even if we have the percentages of people of color that Obama did, which was very high, that unless we have large numbers of people turning out, that then we actually, the White House is at risk as well.
So, what you just said reminded me that when we look at, for example, the low registration or the underperformance of Hispanic voters, whether it's California or across the country in both registration and turnout, one of the things that I've come to the conclusion is the elected officials of many of these safe districts, whether in the state or in a congressional, have no interest in registering new voters, right? Because they don't want to get to learn that if you have more people who are new to you, you're going to have to persuade them that you're the right person. So what I'm hearing you say is that when it comes to the mid-year, the mid-year elections, the congressional in 2014 or 2010, those folks are more interested in making sure they can stay in office and refuse to risk, if you will, in empowering or engaging a new set of electorate. But the only one who can, what happens, the presidential becomes the way to do that if you're like Obama wanting to win, and one hopes whoever the Democratic candidate. I know this is nonpartisan, but you know where I'm coming from. So if the parties and the campaigns, okay, transparency and accountability, but what else? Who else? What else who holds them accountable?
Well, that's, I think, part of what that's why I wrote the book, so I'm around talking to people to try to get as much of a movement going around this as possible. So I think that technology makes it much more possible in terms of being able to have transparency and accountability. So the campaigns do have to submit campaign finance reports. That also be submitted online. Organizations like ProPublica, a very user-friendly, useful tool, the FEC itemizer. You can easily see how the money is actually being spent. And so that helps with transparency. And then the accountability part is technology makes it possible in terms of Twitter, is that, when I have had bad experiences with United Airlines and I tweet out, had a bad experience with United Airlines, and you mention them, they have people who monitor that, and they don't like to be called out in that way. And they contact you, what was wrong? How can we fix it, etc. And so I think similarly, this campaign's not doing what it should do. You tweet that out, that will be, then you put it on, Facebook or what's it, Snapchat. My 14-year-old niece is trying to get me on. So those are ways to hold them accountable in ways that they have never had to answer before. And so I do think that's a way that's democratizing and empowering aspect of the new technology that exists.
Well, in terms of the accountability, perhaps you could share when you attempted to get the various Democratic organizations to reveal, if you will, or how many minority contractors and consultants had they hired, and sort of what happened.
Right.
And what year was that report?
2014.
2014.
So yes, we did, because I had heard that, prominent leader of color challenged the Democratic Party around, you're not doing enough work with consultants of color, et cetera, and then there was a big pushback from the head of the party saying, you don't know the numbers, you don't really know what's going on, and so I guess in some ways that was probably some level of motivation for the book, so I'm they keep saying that we don't know the numbers, and so I'm well, let's get the numbers, and then that will be a tool actually for people who are told that we don't have the numbers, right? So that was really why I wanted to ground the book in great amount of statistical and methodological data. So we looked at all of the Democratic Party spending on consultants in 2010 and 2012, and it was roughly $500 million. And we actually had somebody go through, make a spreadsheet and then go online and look at all of these different consultants. And we found that 97% of the money went to white consultants in a party where 46% of the voters are people of color. And so they were not happy about it. You're not really looking at it right, and that's for television. And I'm who gets to decide which television shows even you're putting it on, right? And so they were not happy at all. To its credit, the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee has made some progress. I actually put Ben Ray Lujan, a younger Latino from Mexico, in charge of that operation. They've actually improved their hiring and have taken more steps in that direction. The Senate side, not so much. I mean, one of the candidates who's running for Senate, he came in to meet with my wife, and she's like, well, what's your plan for the Latinos? How are you going to, and this is a state where there are more people of color eligible non-voting than was the margin of the difference in 2010. It says, well, Latinos are hard nut to crack. We're going to focus on the white working class women. Right? And so this is like a top Democrat within the country. And so this struggle is ongoing and very real and present, particularly in these Senate races, is that if we're going to win Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, Florida, hold Colorado, hold Nevada, win Pennsylvania, which is what we have to do, that we've got to solve that tough nut to crack in terms of reaching out to the voters of color.
So before we go to questions, I want to ask, so what's the reaction been from the political establishment that you do operate in and who come to see you, and how have they reacted to your message?
Well, there's a spectrum, and so we didn't go first to those who were most calling out. We were trying to get the word out and kind of get some momentum up around this. Like saying, so on the House side, they've been we had an event in DC with Nancy Pelosi, and she's like waving the book around, and so, but I think that's also aligned with they're actually trying to do what we're talking about. The Senate side is a long way to go. And that, we were in meeting with the top leadership on the Senate, and I think you can literally count the number of people of color in a staff of 65 people on one hand, or maybe one finger. And so it's just, and then they've never had to answer these questions before, which is what's so fascinating about this. And so you have so that's not as encouraging, but I think what is encouraging is that there actually have been a number of donors we've been putting this message out to them, who've been gravitating towards and have been supportive. And so I just think we've not had much accountability, discussion, debate, struggle within the progressive movement around these issues, period, and I don't think that's healthy. And so I'm privileged to be able to, in a position to say things which have not been said for a long time, and to put it out there without, I'm not trying to get a job in DC, I'm not worried about, things in that regard. And people have been pleased. So we, in the past few weeks, trying to write weekly, and we did a piece, one piece which was very critical of Emily's List around their decision not to endorse a Latina who's leading in the polls, Lucy Flores, in the Nevada, Las Vegas congressional race, and called them out for that. But then a follow-up piece calling out the other parts of progressive infrastructure for the Maryland race, where they're not supporting Donna Edwards, who has the best chance to become the second black woman in the U.S. Senate ever in the history of this country. And so Harry Reid jumped out after a couple days and supported her opponent. So we called them out and supported Emily Liz on the right side there. We haven't had enough history of struggle and debate around this, and so part of what is interesting as I try to put these arguments out there is it's impacting the culture. And so people are mad at first, but if you let them know that we're going to have this conversation, then they kind of deal with it. And I think that's healthy and positive to be able to get at some of these issues.
Well, I could keep asking questions, but I won't monopolize the time. So why don't we go there first?
I'm curious if I could so I agree with your account of the sort of demographic trajectory, but I'm kind of curious why that remains your focus when it seems like that has to translate into a unified political voice. So you mentioned that, in South Africa, the use of physical violence is what kept apartheid in power so long, but you didn't address issues of symbolic violence and strategies of divide and conquer. So my question is, what what makes it easier, in your opinion, to unify the sort of Rainbow Coalition to sort of see their own shared fates and not buy into the sort of rhetoric about illegal, undocumented migrants taking jobs or building walls, etc. And why is that easier rather than converting, I don't know, more whites who have the same views but have similar shared fates in sort of material reality?
Yeah, I think that's a good. I don't want to say that's a good question because when people say that's a good question a lot, I think that implies that the other questions are not good questions. So I do believe that, and I think there's somewhat playing itself in the presidential race really between actually Trump is one phenomenon, but even between Sanders and Clinton, and that I think I do think Sanders leads with the economic populism and the economic inequality and the class issues. I think that the history of this country is such, and the legacy from all of these policies, really the contemporary manifestations of them, is that racial inequality and oppression is a distinct phenomenon, which is related to economic inequality, but it's distinct. And so it needs to have its own specific attention. And so the failure to actually articulate that directly, I feel, will limit a coalition's capacity to move forward. And so that, I think that it has a distinct reality within this, because of the history of this country, is that both in terms of the centrality of race as an issue, so from the very moment that the first English settlers came here and defined themselves in opposition to the Native Americans and then brought over slaves from Africa to work the land. And then it was written into the Constitution, or written into the laws of this country, that race has been and remains a fundamental distinctive issue. So that is also an organizing principle, I think, for a lot of the communities of color to come together around that issue, and the progressive white allies. And so we don't have a majority without progressive white allies. And so that's a central part of the calculation. But progressive whites have never been able to have a majority until there are so many people of color in the country now. So there is this kind of mutuality in that regard. But I do think the history and the contemporary reality of race in America makes it it's not like it's one of the central organizing principles of the country. And I do think that is what happened with Obama's election. I think there was a tremendous catharsis in terms of what his election meant because of the history of the country around what it meant for race. And so that's why I say that, and we're not there yet. And so too many people in the Democratic Party are like, oh, well, that was a one-off, Obama was unique, we don't need to continue building that coalition, we don't need to invest money in those, like this thing that came out about the Soros people putting $15 million into a Latino effort, say, oh, we're doing a Latino effort. But for spending $1 billion, and 46% of the voters are people of color, $15 million does not exactly get you there in terms of what you should actually be spending. So I guess that's a long way of saying that I continually, that race is distinct historically and contemporarily, and that needs to be addressed explicitly in that fashion.
A question back there?
Is there any way of applying these things to state races?
Thank you for asking that.
Yes, and I think that's one of the big challenges, but I do think, as I was saying, one of the things that I am most encouraged by is the movement around district attorneys. And so there is a lot of effort of the energy of the Black Lives Matter movement to specifically, and they had like a national gathering to start getting themselves organized around this, is that these killings of unarmed people of color are so searing emotionally. I mean, regardless of how you are actually organized, you're organizing the opposition to that I think it's a great organizing opportunity to be able to speak directly to that issue and to connect up to that movement. So I had seen signals of that, and that was encouraging to me, just in terms of what some of the leaders of the movement were talking about. They had this national gathering, some of the different funders are interested in that, so it seemed to be bubbling up. But the fact that they took that woman out in Chicago, and that they took the district attorney out in Cleveland, that shows me that there's something there, which is entirely separate from this presidential
vote. You focus on national elections, and so you're working on that. are there people working on state elections, organizing for state offices? Because the Republicans seem to have gone to the state level
Right.
and weren't successful at the national level. And, is there somebody like you in each state?
We keep trying to nurture those people, right?
Yeah,
There are.
Direction, it seems to me.
right, there's not enough, but that's what I'm saying is I think that this district attorney movement is local in states. And I think that can be, that there's evidence there that can be underpinning of mobilizing within states that's not dependent upon the federal and the national piece. But it's critical to do that. I mean, there's absolutely no excuse for minimally having lost the governorships of Maryland, Massachusetts, and Illinois, and these extremely blue states, but because people aren't actually organizing in those states and actually turning out. So, but I think it's one of the questions that's going to be the challenge for where we go from here. And so there's a lot of tremendous energy in terms of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and lots of fundraising potential and organizing potential. Is that going to move towards the states? And can it be moved towards the states and looking at 2018 and what we're actually going to do in that context?
So let's go to this side, right here in the white. Yeah.
So I've heard you saying that the attraction of the undecided white voters, that they tend to be consistent voters over time, and I'm with you that we need to work more towards people of color. But what about possibly a longer-term strategy of investing in creating a culture of voting or an identity as a voter in communities of color?
You mean you don't understand why voting is on a Tuesday and you don't get off of work, whereas the rest of the world seems to take a holiday to vote?
Yes, if we wanted people to vote, right, so it actually sometimes like where the political leaders, people don't want people to, so I worked with Common Cause, some other organizations in 2010, I think it was, on a bill for online voter registration in California, in terms of the states. We could not get it passed that first year. An overwhelmingly Democratic legislature with a Democratic governor. Although at one point I put on Facebook, just imagine what would be possible if we had a Democratic governor in California. But so we had to come back a second year. We actually got it passed. 800,000 people registered to vote in 6 weeks. As the study by Lisa Garcia Bedoya from Berkeley demonstrated. So, that's what I was down in San Diego a couple weeks ago, and you may know this from being from Mexico originally, that Mexico runs, I believe hourly, on the PSA announcements on the radio in San Diego about the elections in Mexico, targeting Mexican nationals, making sure they know about their elections, which are in July. San Diego does not run announcements about elections in San Diego. So there are some basic things that can and should be done. So, but that I think is one of the essential questions. I don't know if you have to think this too. I said there's 3 million eligible non-voting Latinos in Texas. Texas elections are decided by from 600,000 to 900,000 votes. So that's not just an issue of knocking on more doors. There's something cultural and like behavioral science I think has to be brought in that regard. So.
And I would just want to point out to remind folks that for a country that believes and articulates democracy and attempts to export democracy around the planet, we leave the actual, what happened in Arizona during the Arizona primary where they closed some of the polling sites and the lines were really long. We leave the actual process of conducting an election to each and every county. Mexico has a centralized election system. So I'll stop there. Paul?
Okay, there's some very interesting ideas here, and I'm going to add one. Let's be honest about it. Clinton is trying to get the women vote. Sanders is trying to get the young vote. Is there a crossover possibility young black women and Latino women can be a focus of the Democratic Party?
Well, that absolutely should be and need
Why not?
to be.
Why can't we do that? And cut right through the two different camps.
Right. Well,
because I think a lot is going to depend upon, what happens what Bernie does as the primary season goes on, what he does with that energy, how does he, be a unified family, right? At the moment, until it's resolved, each campaign in those two are going to have their own strategy about how to attract
But
young
at
women.
some point, these two people have to come together for the interests of the party and the country.
Well, that's a longer conversation about whether.
But this conversation has to happen now. Okay?
Yes.
And unless you raise it, it's not gonna happen, because both these camps have their strategies, and of course they're, just like you told us, these guys, consultants, are gonna tell, this is the way to win, because they're making money on the deal. Somebody has to come up with a new idea, and it looks like to me, you're willing to do it.
Well, it's a complicated piece, but I do think that there has to be, we were just talking about this around the vice presidency, is that I want to actually wage a campaign around desegregating the vice presidency. We've never had a vice president of color in the history of this country.
Okay, why don't we start there?
Right, so why don't we start there? And I actually think we need to, in order to, because both of the leading Democratic candidates are older white candidates. And so I think there needs to be balance with a younger person of
How do
color.
we start this? That's the question.
Well, let's go to a question back
I
there.
have a Facebook author page, Steve Phillips, you can go there, it's like that, we'll be putting information on there about how do we, so I actually want to wage a more public campaign around this vice presidency piece. So.
I have a quick comment and then a question. I'm a refugee from San Francisco, a great progressive city. That's been massively gentrified. I know you know this, Steve. Massively gentrified by progressive whites and people of color who are politicians who control City Hall. There's massive gentrification going on. The African American communities rapidly drop. The Latinos here percent of the mission. There's also widespread police brutality. The progressive mayor will not fire the white police chief, who presides over a totally racist, homophobic police department. And this is a progressive Chinese American man who absolutely refuses to fire him, no matter how many thousands of people you turn out to protest. So my question to you, in all due respect, I know numbers are important in terms of voting, but that's not where the real power is. Don't you think you have to look at the political, economic, and media institutions as to who controls the media and the elections and these PACs and the billions of dollars? You say, if you have to raise $1 billion to run for president, doesn't that mean they're going to be beholden to the banks and the corporations and the PACs? In all due respect, like both Clintons are and were in the 90s. Who started all this neoliberal economic inequality? Where did it start? It started with neoliberal Democrats, and the same thing, in all due respect, is happening in San Francisco and Berkeley and Oakland.
So,
Yeah, no, I do believe though still that, I'm going to say that politics is war without bloodshed. I think that you can actually take power through the numbers in the voting. And so it would be interesting, and you saw in California that, is a perfect example, was that the ballot measure was put on qualified for the ballot to raise the minimum wage $15 an hour. And so that was not something that the governor wanted. And it was not something that there was necessarily majority support in the legislature for. But they knew that the voters were going to vote for that. And so that is then what motivated them. And Jerry Brown said this much, that the reason that they moved forward the legislation, to go ahead and sign the legislation, to move it to raise the minimum wage $15, was because they feared the power of the voters. And so I do believe that having these numbers makes a lot more possible. This is one of my central arguments, and I try to talk about this in my policy chapter, is that we're constrained and too timid in the public policies that are put forward because we do not fully appreciate the power of this electorate. And this election is the perfect example. I mean, 20 years ago, not 20 years ago, 8 years ago, I would have been shocked to say that one of the leading candidates for president was a Democratic Socialist, running unapologetically as a Democratic Socialist. And we're discussing it as part of the whole conversation. So that is a reflection to me of much more is possible politically because the composition of the electorate has changed dramatically over the past period.
you in the back, standing? Yes.
My question is, so I was involved with the 50-state strategy in 2006 and the Obama work in 2008. What do you think holds back the Democratic Party from like institutionalizing all that organizing talent and ability and knowledge? Because it doesn't seem like it really evolves over time. It gets better and better. It seems like it gets swirled away into different consulting firms? And do you have any ideas on how we could subvert that process and build something better? Because it does, I mean, neither candidate on the Democratic side now is anywhere near as competent as Obama's team or as advanced in terms of the way they're organizing. So I think that's a real shame.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, for one, is I agree with you 100% that we need to move, that needs to be a top priority to move it forward. I mean, I do think that the nature of change in history is fits and starts, and you move forward, things fall back, and that's just kind of, I think, how life unfolds. But I think that we have a great opportunity to do that. It was interesting, I was just meeting with the chair of the Ohio Democratic Party, who they actually they've hired 30 full-time staff people 6 months ago to start to build up the field operation within Ohio and not just get obsessed with 30-second ads and that. So they're actually trying to put in place this infrastructure. And he was saying the exact same thing. He's like, well, why don't we have more of this permanent, consistent organizing actually going on? So this is another potential campaign and demand I want to look at, is to actually demand of the party, have like an online campaign and different organizing to take some percentage, even if it's just 1% or 2% of the money that you actually spend, and put it into a permanent 50-state type fund. So we actually could have staff in an ongoing fashion. So there's that, and then the other thing, as long as we're putting things out that may or may not get us in trouble, is that the chair of the Democratic Party is an elected position. And so I think we should be thinking about a candidate to run for chair of the party who would have these different types of ideas. And even if you don't win, you run on an agenda that then talks about reforming the party, moving the resources in the direction of the emerging voters, investing in that kind of a fashion. And then through that process, then hopefully you can win some concessions to however that election ultimately plays itself out.
Right.
This thing of race and politics confuses me a little bit. Why do you think that we might not become like any other Latin American country in which people goes from left to right, regardless of race? For instance, in this election, we have had a black candidate and 2 Latin candidates, unfortunately, in the wrong party, you might concern. As a Latino, I am inclined at this time to vote for Bernie Sanders, if I may, because I think he is speaking to me. The other Latino candidates, unfortunately, I'm not speaking. So, in the future, are we going to become like any other Latin American country in which there's a lot of participation in politics? Most countries have a system in which if you don't vote, you get fined, so then you have to vote.
So your question is, why does race figure in so prominently, and why isn't the future for this country a division that is basically between left and right, and so, or as I'd like to say, someone speaking only of Latinos, or just generally the country?
In the whole country.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the
I have an answer, but I'll let Steve.
More participation will take us into the.
Well, I mean, I think ultimately, I think that is what we need to look at going. What is the fundamental policy plans, proposals, and who are they benefiting? And so either Bernie Sanders, in my opinion, either Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton is going to do more for the Latino population, people of color, than Ben Carson or Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio would have done. And so I used to say, people say this back in the 60s, we don't just want black faces in high places, we want political power. And so ultimately it's what is the conditions that are gonna, it's not just the single melanin content or historical background of that single individual, it's what's happening with those people. And so that's why I think it's still a significant issue in this country, is that the wealth of America was built on the exploitation of people of color. And so it's integrally intertwined And so the race and the economic exploitation are so tightly connected. Slavery developed so much of the wealth. Much of the Southwest was taken from Mexico. Chinese American laborers built the Transcontinental Railroad. And so that to me is why those communities are in fact more progressive, because they've created this wealth and they've not participated in it. And so they're economically worse off. And so to empower them, you need to speak both to their economic conditions as well as to their racial and cultural circumstances. But I'm curious as to what your take.
Well, certainly I agree with everything you said in terms of why race is so inextricably intertwined with the economics and then therefore the politics. But I think putting on just my Latina activist hat, in terms of this country, if we could solve the nut of the underperformance of Hispanics in the registration and voting, ultimately I think it would be better for this country if both the left and the right were fighting for the Latino vote, so that the swing voter is not just a white, older, but a Latino voter, because I think that ultimately could move us less to be so polarized. But I had hoped that it was going to be Jeb Bush and Hillary, because they'd be fighting for the Latino vote, but that's not happening. And I think what I'm worried about is that the Democrats are going to think, well, with Trump out there, we don't actually have to do much with Hispanics or Asian Americans because, or Muslims, because they're all going to go. And I'm worried that they're not going to make the investment until October 1st, right? So there was a question, yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious, bring it to the state level about Linda Sanchez versus Kamala Harris. Is that a mistake on the part of the Democratic Party to put up two women of color for the Senate? I mean, they're both candidates.
Mistake in what way?
Well, it seems to me that, I don't know, I'm asking you, is that the right strategy for them to put up, towards the multiracial society, to have an African-American woman and a Latina woman vying for the Senate seat?
Well, I think it does, it presents some of the challenges. I mean, I'm a friend of Kamala and her family and a big supporter of hers, but I would not say that the Democratic Party put up with Loretta Sanchez. I mean, she put herself up in that context, but be that as it may, it's a free country, you can run it, anybody can run. But it's an interesting issue because it does raise the limitations. I'm going back to this question on what's the underlying agenda in reality. And so there have been some people who have gone to Loretta, it's like, well, we've never had a Latino senator, so this is our chance, and it's our turn. But there's only one Senate seat, and we never had an Asian American. Well, what's this? How you call it back in the day? But there's Asian Americans and African Americans. What about that? We only have one candidate, and so you can't just be a question around what is the specific singular identity of this individual, how much do they reflect my. You have to think about who's going to be the best representative for the full population across all those different groups. And so that's, I think, the issue we're going to have to get to more and more, because it's as we grapple with how do you manifest these, where you put your political energy in the context of this diverse society, it can get confusing. That's one example. I think it was wrong for Sanchez to get in after Kamala had already put together this, because it divides too much of the time, energy, and resources of the progressive movement in that regard. And I think we've seen these things playing themselves out in other places as well. But it does manifest the challenges that come with a multiracial society.
So we have time for a couple more quick questions. So back there.
Go ahead.
Most of what you've been talking about is around sort of the political parties and campaigns investments in terms of voter turnout. But as you mentioned, Black Lives Matter, that's a people's movement or civil society engagement, and that's where I sit. So I'm curious, what other models you would recommend to look at in terms of the role of civil society organizations in mobilizing emerging voters, in registering new voters. We're looking at a big effort nationally to try to do that this year, and it would be great to see what models to look at for that.
So, I mean, I do feel like though that, I mean, in my own in my own politics, my own evolution, I've moved more towards focusing in on the parties. Because that was the quote about Rob Banks, because that's where the money is, right? And so that if the Democrats are going to spend $3 billion and 46% of Democratic voters are people of color, I feel we should go get that money. And so and push them and force them to move more of it into the direction of like, why out? I mean, Bernie and Hillary between them have raised like $250 million. So they can't spend 2 or 3 to give to the Black Lives Matter movement so that they can train candidates to run and train operatives on how to run those campaigns and do voter registration programs. So that's where a lot of my focus is now. Is I think the money is there, it's going to be spent. And it can either be spent on television ads or it can be spent in partnership with community organizations and with more indigenous community leaders and whatnot. So and I think that they're susceptible to pressure. I think we can actually have some success in terms of trying to impact them and move some of those resources. So that's where a lot of my focus is these days.
So last question over there, the gentleman in black.
Okay. Do you believe that campaign finance reform will address issues that you talked about in the book regarding expenditures and misuse of funds? And how possible do you think it is for the Democratic Party to adopt such policies, given that they don't stand to benefit from adopting the policies?
It's a fascinating moment that we're in, and so I haven't fully thought through the whole answer around that piece, but we're in this fascinating moment where post Citizens United, where there's like this unleashed torrent of, the Billionaires Empowerment Act, right? Where you can spend as much money as you want to spend without any kind of accountability and it hasn't worked. And so that's what's so fascinating to me. So Bush went around, I still think illegally, raised $100 million in case he was going to run. But to what end? And then, so you have that as one reality. And then the other side of the coin, you have Bernie Sanders and $27 contributions, who has his own kind of campaign finance reform. So without any changes in the laws, he's raising unbelievable amounts of money, $46 million in a single month over month. And so I'm not so sure that the focus needs to be on changing the laws. That we have the capacity, as Sanders has shown, that you can create a fundraising engine that can go toe-to-toe with the billionaires without having to get caught up in a huge, protracted, expensive legal battle. So I'm like, we have the technology. When Sanders, after one of his elections, it's like, I'm not going to Wall Street to hold a big fundraiser. In fact, I'm going to do one right now. Go to BernieSanders.com. Okay, fundraiser's over. Right? So I think that's an indication of what's possible. And so I think that's where I think we should be trying to figure out how do we use technology to link together people around the country. But I guess that's my final point is that my central argument that we have the numbers. Progressive people of color and progressive whites together are the majority of people. And so we need to hold that confidence and act with that confidence that we can win, we can reshape society. I think in that regard we can utilize the technology to connect us all up together, to be able to generate the resources, to be able to move our movement forward. So that I think is my fundamental message and takeaway, I think, from all of you. So.
Well, that's a good note to end on. I want to say thank you. I know we could have continued this conversation for quite a bit. So thank you, and I hope all of you will